The first sound I remember was not of a voice, but of rain striking the stone flags of the quadrangle. It was early, long before chapel, and I'd walked there not to pray, but to avoid the heaviness of my rooms. Oxford, in its September dampness, carries a silence that is not quite silence at all, the drip of eaves, the roll of a bicycle wheel over gravel, the occasional cough of a porter who has smoked too much. One learns to hear absence and to mistake it for calm. I had no reason to be in St. Simeon's that morning. The college was not mine, though I knew its cloisters well enough. I'd been asked, discreetly, to look into something by a man who pretended it was nothing. It was always thus the great machinery of human tragedy began with the smallest, almost laughable request. And so I wandered, as if I had come simply to admire the masonry, which in truth I did. The carvings along the hall were worn smooth, saints whose faces had been washed into anonymity by centuries of weather. Their silence was heavier than any sermon. The porter, a pale man with stiff shoulders, had muttered that I would find no trouble there. No trouble, sir. His eyes betrayed something else, though an unease, as if he had been forced to hold in his mouth a word he dared not speak. I had filed it away, with the same care one folds a crossword solution into a pocket for later. Crosswords. That morning's Times had given me little satisfaction. 7 down. Quiet Oxford figure, never quite alive, a clue that lingered at the edge of memory. The answer would not come, and perhaps it never should. Yet there was the faintest rustle of recognition, as though the compiler had been privy to my walk beneath those stone arches. I left the clue unsolved, a silence of its own kind. The chapel was open. I stepped inside, though I had no business with God. The air smelled of polish and damp wool. Wooden pews lined the narrow nave, each with its catalogue of scratches and initials carved by boys long since forgotten. Above, a muted shaft of light fell from the high window, illuminating dust as if it were confetti drifting after some unrecorded celebration. I stood there too long, I suspect, for when I turned, I noticed the verger watching me. He said nothing, only closed the hymn book he had been arranging. In Oxford, silence is a language more fluent than speech. What did I expect to find? Not a body, not yet. Only the peculiar tension one feels when something is amiss in a place built for stillness. And indeed, there it was. A door left ajar to the vestry. A candlestick not quite aligned. These were not clues in the vulgar sense, not evidence one could present in a courtroom. They were the whispers of disorder, and to a mind like mine, disorder is more telling than confession. I returned to the quadrangle. A girl passed me with a satchel slung untidily, her gown loose at the shoulders. She hummed under her breath a tune I could not place, though I knew it from somewhere. Elgar, perhaps, or some hymn of resignation. I stopped her with a question about directions, feigned and unnecessary. She answered briskly, but in the instant of her reply, I noticed the ink on her fingers, dark and recent, as though she had been marking more than essays. I thanked her, and she moved on, her humming fading into the cloister. That was when the bell struck the hour, not with solemn grandeur, but with a cracked, uneven tone. It echoed across the courtyard and died into the walls. Stone remembers differently from men. Where we forget, it absorbs. I wondered what St. Simeon's had absorbed in its long life, what quarrels, what whispers, what promises never honored. I left with nothing certain, only silence and the nagging thought that silence itself may be the most articulate witness. The porter nodded as I passed him once more. "Still no trouble, sir," he murmured, though his voice wavered. I walked back into the Oxford rain, thinking of 7 down. Quiet Oxford figure, never quite alive. The clue remained unfinished, though the answer, like the crime itself, was already somewhere within reach, buried in stone, waiting for a man foolish enough to listen. It came not as a summons, but as a sheet of paper folded twice and slipped beneath my door. The porter at my own lodgings swore he had not seen the hand that left it. I believed him. People in Oxford prefer to conceal themselves behind stone, and one seldom knows who is listening or watching. I'd been halfway through a tepid whiskey when I discovered it, the glass sweating faintly on the sill beside me. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the street still glistened, the lamps turning puddles into miniature mirrors. The note lay where the draught had blown it, corner curling as if reluctant to be read. I did not touch it at once. Anonymous words demand hesitation. They too often reveal more about the writer than about the subject. The paper smelled faintly of polish, perhaps from a library desk. The writing, not handwriting, was precise but uneven, as though struck on an old machine. I read it once, then again, the brevity forcing me to dwell upon each word. A death, it suggested, had not been natural. St. Simeon's, the report said, is keeping a silence too heavy for coincidence. If you care for truth more than reputation, walk the quadrangle after dark. Nothing else. No signature. No embellishment. I found myself tracing the shape of the sentence. The choice of quadrangle, not cloister. Of truth, not justice. A writer who distrusted institutions, yet appealed to the vanity of the investigator. There was cunning in the phrasing. And something else, an odd spacing between words, as though the typewriter's keys had stuck and been hurried along. I recalled an earlier case where the same irregularities had betrayed the author long before the confession. Subtle fingerprints, more eloquent than any ink. The next morning I walked again through St. Simeon's. The rain had lifted into a sky of blank pewter, light falling without color. Students hurried with collars turned high, carrying books that might outlive them. In the porter's lodge, the same stiff-shouldered man sat at his desk, polishing spectacles that seemed never quite clean. He asked, unconvincingly, if I was looking for someone. I replied that I was only passing through, admiring the architecture. He smiled thinly, as though architecture had never inspired admiration in him. I thought of showing him the note, but did not. To share a fragment is to surrender the advantage. Instead, I asked whether all had been well at the college. He nodded too soon, too firmly. I pressed no further. One learns more from the eagerness of denial than from confession. In the library, I lingered over shelves that smelt of dust and parchment, running a finger along cracked spines. The silence was not pure. It was curdled by the presence of a single reader at the long table. A young man, pale and angular, scratching notes with a fountain pen. His head bent so low that his hair brushed the paper. He seemed too intent, too urgent for ordinary study. When he rose and left, I noticed the smudge of ink upon his cuff, and I thought of the girl in the quadrangle with her stained fingers. Patterns, like faint pencil marks beneath the surface of a painting, began to align. That night I returned alone as the note had instructed. The quadrangle was emptied of laughter and footsteps, its stone walls breathing a silence so complete that I could hear the rustle of my own coat. The windows glowed faintly, each eye watching or refusing to watch. Nothing happened. No figure stepped from the shadows. No revelation arrived. And yet the absence was eloquent. Something had been expected of me. The silence was not a vacancy, but a calculation. Back in my room I laid the note beside the crossword. 10 across had resisted me all evening, anonymous source of warning. 6 letters. It came suddenly, with a faint stab of irony. Letter, the simplest word, the most obvious, and still it unsettled me, as though the compiler had conspired with my unknown correspondent. I closed the paper, poured the last of the whiskey, and sat there listening to the city's heartbeat fading into the walls. There are places in Oxford where the city seems to end abruptly, as though a wall has been raised against the rest of the world. St. Simeon's was one such place. The high gates, locked with a key kept jealously in the porter's lodge, gave the impression of a community intent on secrecy. Once inside, one felt observed, not by individuals, but by the weight of centuries that pressed down upon every corridor and stairwell. It was not simply a college, it was a fortress of memory, and memory in Oxford is always selective. I had been granted permission to return, formally this time, and I walked through those gates as though stepping into a cloistered republic. The quad was narrow, the lawn too neatly clipped, the windows too regularly spaced. A closed world? Yes. One in which rumors circulated like blood through unseen veins. I imagined that if one sat still long enough on one of the benches, one would hear the half-whispered scandals, the petty feuds, the delicate cruelties that keep such places alive. The warden received me in his study, a room that smelt of sherry and old vellum. He was courteous, even welcoming, though his welcome was that of a man who has trained himself in diplomacy rather than warmth. He asked after my health, my work, and only then what had brought me into their cloisters. I told him that questions had been raised, quiet questions, about the well-being of the college. He smiled at this and said there had been no incident of note. Yet I noticed the way he rearranged a stack of letters as he spoke, his hand lingering upon one envelope longer than the rest. He was a man too practiced to betray alarm, but not so practiced as to conceal unease. I stored the gesture away, like a scrap torn from a larger design. I left him and walked through the cloisters. The stones seemed to exhale as I passed. I paused at the chapel door but did not enter. Instead, I turned toward the dining hall. A long table stretched beneath portraits that stared down with the severe serenity of those who had believed in duty more than in kindness. The smell of polish and candle wax lingered. At the far end, a scout moved silently, folding napkins into exact triangles. He looked up only briefly when I asked whether all was well. "Quite so, sir," he replied, and returned to his napkins. His voice was flat, but the tremor in his hands betrayed another truth. Napkins tremble only under fear, or guilt, or both. In such places, hierarchy is not announced, it is absorbed. One senses who is permitted to speak and who is expected to listen. The young defer to the old, the servants to the scholars, and the scholars to tradition itself. Yet behind each bowed head there lurks a resentment or an ambition. I had lived long enough among such corridors to know that where there is silence, there is disquiet. Later, walking along the library gallery, I came across a notice board. It was littered with scraps, tutorial lists, concert announcements, a rowing schedule. One sheet caught my eye at a memorial service for a former fellow, held the previous term. The name was unfamiliar, but the date was not. It coincided precisely with the time when rumors of unrest had first reached me. I made a note of it mentally. It was never the obvious events that mattered in Oxford, but the resonances they left behind. Returning to the quad, I paused again. The girl with the satchel passed me once more, this time not humming but whispering to a friend whose face I did not catch. Their voices sank into silence as they saw me. I wondered whether she carried another letter in that satchel, waiting to be slipped beneath another door. She glanced back just once, and in that glance was both fear and defiance. When I left through the great gates, the porter handed me the visitor's book to sign. My name stood there in neat black ink, alone beneath a page of blank lines. A closed world records what it wishes and ignores the rest. Yet the act of signing gave me the odd sense that I had been admitted not as a guest, but as a witness. I closed the book, and the porter locked the gate behind me with a sound that echoed far too loudly against the stone. The difficulty with Oxford is never the absence of suspects, but the abundance of them. Every set of rooms conceals its quarrels, every staircase its whispered grievances. St. Simeon's was no different. The trick lay not in discovering who bore resentment, but in discerning which resentment was strong enough to alter the pattern of a life and its end. I began, as one must, with the names most visible. The young man I'd seen in the library, his head bent almost to the paper, was called Bennett, a scholar of indifferent means but relentless ambition. His tutors praised his diligence, though I suspected it was diligence directed less toward truth than toward advancement. His ink-stained cuffs were a small detail, but details accumulate. When asked of the late fellow whose memorial notice I had seen, he grew oddly evasive, claiming no memory of the man. Too swift a denial, too careful. One remembers colleagues, if only to forget them properly. Then there was the girl with the satchel, whose name I learned was Cartwright. A music student, not brilliant, but persistent, given to humming fragments of Elgar when she thought herself unobserved. She had been friendly with the deceased fellow, or so another student, hesitant, implied. Yet when I approached her in the quad, she insisted she had barely known him, that she had only once spoken to him about a score left behind in the chapel. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shifted toward the porter's lodge with a trace of unease. She was either lying badly or telling the truth too carefully. In Oxford, there is little difference. The porter himself, Grimshaw by name, was less subtle. He maintained the familiar pose of loyal servant keys jangling at his belt, spectacles wiped, voice deferential. Yet his shoulders tightened each time I entered, as though the sight of me required a physical bracing. When I asked if he had known the fellow well, he said only, "He kept to himself, sir. I could not help but think of the anonymous letter slipped under my own door. A porter has access to more doors than anyone." And yet Grimshaw struck me not as author, but as a courier, useful, silent, perhaps compelled. The warden I had already considered, and found him too polished to dismiss. His courtesy masked something darker, not malice, but fear. His hands lingered on the correspondence, his voice sharpened when I mentioned rumors of disquiet. He wished above all else for the name of the college to remain unsullied. Reputation can kill as swiftly as hatred. That evening I dined at the common table, invited as an observer. Conversation flowed, but with the careful restraint of men conscious of being overheard. The hall flickered with candlelight, casting the faces into shadow and half-shadow. I watched them as one watches the shifting pieces of a chessboard, noting who avoided whose gaze, who raised a glass too often, who listened without speaking. Each gesture, each silence was a move. A small deduction arrived midway through the meal. One of the fellows, a historian with a nervous laugh, remarked upon the coldness of the chapel, saying it was always draughty even with the door shut. Yet when I had stood there days earlier, the vestry door had been left ajar. It was not draught, but intrusion that disturbed the air. I made a note of it in my mind, beneath the hum of cutlery and subdued talk. Afterwards, I stepped outside into the darkened quad. The air was sharp, the silence broken only by the faint creak of a bicycle wheel somewhere beyond the gates. Shadows gathered along the cloisters, thick and impenetrable. Figures passed briefly, faces indistinct, voices lowered. It seemed the college itself conspired in concealment, wrapping each of its inhabitants in secrecy. Later in my room, I opened the crossword. 14 down asked for a word meaning hidden companion, 7 letters. I tried an ally, a partner, and a comrade. The answer, when it came, was shadow. An obvious word, yet the clue unsettled me. For in St. Simeon's, shadows were plentiful, and every one of them bore a human shape. I closed the paper, the silence around me too deep to feel innocent. It was in the library that the slip occurred so small that most ears would have passed over it. A gathering of fellows, a half-hearted conversation about Milton, and one of them, the historian with the nervous laugh, recited a line too glibly. "They also serve those who sit and wait," he said. The words fell neatly enough, but they were wrong. Milton had written, "Stand and wait." The alteration was deliberate or unconscious, but either way it caught my attention like a stone in the shoe. In Oxford, quotation is currency. To misquote is not only careless, it is revealing. Was he confessing to waiting, to watch, or merely showing the kind of vanity that wishes to appear cultured without bearing the weight of accuracy? I filed it away, quietly. The afternoon had been heavy with rain. Water streaked the mullioned windows, blurring the view of the quad until the stone looked liquid. Students drifted in and out, muttering about timetables, their shoes squeaking against the parquet. I remained in the far corner, pretending to consult a volume of Donne, though my eyes were on the librarian. She was a severe woman, her hair bound tightly, spectacles perched low. She noticed everything, and in noticing, revealed her own preferences, who she greeted with warmth, who with indifference. When Bennett entered, she stiffened almost imperceptibly, then returned to her ledger. It was a gesture small enough to miss, but gestures, like quotations, betray their authors. Later, in the cloisters, I encountered Cartwright again. She was carrying her satchel, humming faintly under her breath. I asked her, casually, whether she had read Milton. She smiled with a mixture of irony and discomfort, replying that music was her discipline, not poetry. Still, she said, she liked the line about sitting and waiting. Sitting, not standing. The same error. I asked her where she had heard it. She shrugged, said it was always quoted that way in conversation. I let it rest, though the answer settled uneasily in me. Words travel, but errors travel faster. The same misquotation from two mouths suggested a common source, an origin point. I thought then of the anonymous letter. Its typewritten words, its peculiar spacing. Someone who liked phrases, who dressed truth in half-remembered lines. A scholar, yes, but a careless one. Careless in ink, careless in quotation. The shape of the thing began, faintly, to appear. That evening I walked again through the quad. Lamps glowed faintly against the mist, the air rich with damp stone. A group of students hurried past me, laughing too loudly, the sound echoing unnaturally. Beyond them, silence stretched, dense and watchful. I paused beneath the chapel arch, where a notice had been pinned. A concert to be held next week. Elgar Vaughan Williams, a requiem whose title blurred in the rain. Beneath it, someone had scribbled a line of poetry, almost illegible. They also served the pen had run out of ink halfway. A fragment left hanging. The porter found me reading it. He remarked with studied casualness that students were always leaving graffiti, scraps of verse, bits of nothing. I agreed, but my mind returned to the same refrain. Nothing is ever quite nothing in Oxford. Back in my room, the crossword offered little solace. 12 across famous errors in quotation, 10 letters. I stared at it, drained my glass, and finally wrote solecism. The word sat there, too neat, too final. Yet the comfort of it was fragile, like the misquoted line itself. It was not the misquotation that mattered, but the repetition of it, whispered from different mouths, marked on paper, drifting like smoke through the corridors of St. Simeon's. Somewhere behind that small distortion lay the hand that had written to me, and perhaps the hand that had shaped something far graver than words. It was in the senior common room that the evening turned curious. I had been invited cordially, if not warmly, to take a glass of claret with the fellows. The room smelled of tobacco, varnish, and old upholstery, a mixture of comfort and fatigue. Portraits lined the walls, their painted eyes half obscured by candlelight. Wine was poured generously, perhaps too generously. In Oxford, abundance is seldom innocent. The historian, the same who had misquoted Milton, grew talkative after his second glass. He spoke of archives, of marginalia, of the pleasures of cataloguing what others had neglected. His voice was too bright, as if rehearsed. When I pressed him, gently, about the deceased fellow whose name lingered on the memorial sheet, he waved a hand, declaring the man eccentric, solitary, hardly worth remembering. Yet in the gesture broad, carelessly noticed a stain of red on his cuff. Not ink this time, but wine, soaked too deep into the linen for a recent accident. It suggested a habit. A man who spilled often, who concealed little, who perhaps used levity as a shield. Across from him, Bennett remained silent, cradling his glass with a kind of reverence. When laughter rose around him, he did not join. Instead, he fixed his gaze on the warden, who responded with a tight smile. A current passed between them, unnoticed by the rest. Not hostility exactly, but an understanding, like two players recognizing a move on the chessboard. I tasted the wine, found it good, though my mind was elsewhere. Too many conversations blurred into each other, each designed to distract. The music student Cartwright had been invited as well, on the pretext of providing entertainment later in the evening. She sat at the edge of the circle, her hands folded, her glass untouched. When asked if she would sing, she demurred, saying her throat was tired from rehearsal. Her excuse was accepted with polite nods, but I saw her fingers twitch upon her lap, restless, uneasy. I rose to examine a shelf of books, though I knew them already. The bindings gleamed, unread. One volume had been shifted recently, dust displaced along its spine. I pulled it out. Inside was not Milton, nor Donne, but a ledger of college accounts, a careless misplacement or deliberate concealment. I returned it unremarked. The noise of conversation resumed around me, too loud, too practiced. Wine has a way of loosening tongues, but it also clouds them. The more they spoke, the less they revealed. A red herring, as the fishermen call it, is drawn across the trail to confuse the dogs. That night the room was filled with herrings, swimming in claret and smoke. I let them speak, noting what was avoided more than what was said. The dead fellow's name was mentioned only once, and too quickly dismissed. His absence hung heavier than his presence had ever done. When the evening ended, I walked alone into the misted quad. My head was clear enough, though the taste of the wine lingered bitterly. The porter closed the gate behind me, his keys rattling like a warning. As I stepped onto the wet cobbles, I recalled the crossword clue from that morning. 17 down diversion in pursuit, 3 words. I had struggled with it all day. Now, in the cool air, the answer arrived. Red herring. Too neat, too precise. I almost smiled at the compiler's cruel accuracy. In my room I poured a final measure, smaller than usual. The wine of the common room had left me restless, not sated. Their laughter still echoed, hollow, rehearsed. I thought of Bennett's silence, Cartwright's twitching fingers, the historian's easy misquotation, the warden's practiced smile. Each glass raised that evening had not been to friendship, nor to scholarship, but to concealment. The red herrings swam thick around me, and the water was growing darker. It was not discovery that unsettled me that morning, but an accident. In the warden's study, while he answered a summons at the door, I found myself glancing idly across his desk. There were papers stacked with the precision of a man who wishes to appear orderly, even when chaos gnaws beneath. And half concealed beneath those papers, a photograph no larger than a postcard, its corner jutting like a beckoning finger. I should not have touched it, yet I did. The image showed a gathering in the quad's summer evening, the sun low, shadows long. The deceased fellow stood at the edge, face turned awkwardly toward the camera, as though reluctant to be caught. Around him, familiar figures, Bennett, Cartwright, the historian, even Grimshaw the porter lurking at the periphery. What struck me most was not who was present, but who was absent. The warden himself, whose study this was, had not been there. Or had he? A gap in the line suggested someone had been cropped away. I replaced the photograph before the warden returned. He spoke easily of funding, of benefactions, of the routine burdens of office. His voice was steady, but I kept thinking of the gap in that image, the blankness where someone should have stood. Silence in stone, silence in pictures. Both speak if one listens. Later, I walked into town. The streets gleamed from a night of rain. Bicycles leaned at uncertain angles, the smell of damp newspapers clinging to the air. I carried the photograph in my mind, examining it as one examines a crossword clue, turning it round until something shifts. 6 across in that morning's puzzle asked, "Picture missing part, 9 letters." The answer was incomplete. I had not written it in. Yet the clue accompanied me like an echo. At St. Simeon's Library, I sought out Cartwright. She was hunched over a score, pencil poised, lips moving to a rhythm she did not play aloud. I asked whether she remembered the evening of the photograph. She looked startled, then said, of course, it had been a concert rehearsal, nothing more. Her tone was too light, rehearsed. When I remarked that the warden had not attended, she frowned, insisting he had, that he had spoken briefly before departing. But in the picture he was absent or exercising. Which truth was the greater? I could not decide. As I left, I saw Bennett by the notice board, reading slowly, lips shaping words without sound. A man rehearsing, I thought, not reading. He glanced toward me, and I noticed again the ink on his hands, the stains that refused to leave him. He asked if I had enjoyed the claret the previous evening. His smile was faint, too faint. I replied that it had been good enough. He nodded, satisfied with the ambiguity, and walked away. The porter stopped me near the gate. He asked, almost too casually, if I had found what I was looking for. I said nothing, only asked if he remembered who had taken the photograph that summer. He hesitated, then said it had been one of the students, a boy now gone to London. He could not recall the name. His eyes avoided mine as he spoke, fixed instead on the key he twisted between his fingers. The gesture was nervous, rehearsed, the same gesture I had seen before. I thanked him and left. That night in my room, I unfolded the newspaper. The crossword remained incomplete. 6 across still waited. Picture missing part. The answer came now, with the photograph in mind. A word too ordinary for what it carried. A snapshot shows not only what is present, but what has been excluded. A cropped image, a deliberate absence, a silence as sharp as any cry. I set down the paper, poured a measure of whiskey, and listened to the rain beginning again upon the stone. The city spoke in whispers, and all of them pointed toward what was missing. It was the smallest things that carried the greatest weight. In the library, late one afternoon, I noticed a volume left open on a desk. It was a collection of sermons, dry as dust, not the kind a student would consult willingly. The pages were worn, the spine cracked, but what caught my attention was absence. A leaf had been neatly excised, leaving behind a faint ridge of glue and a jagged edge where paper should have continued. I asked the librarian whether the book had been damaged recently. She frowned, claimed she had not noticed, and returned to her ledger. Her eyes gave her away. She had noticed, and she knew who had sat at that desk, but she was bound by a loyalty stronger than honesty. Silence again, the language of St. Simeon's. I ran a finger along the tier. The missing page had not been ripped in haste. It had been cut carefully, with a blade fine enough to leave the margin smooth. Not vandalism, then, but selection. Someone had wanted those words, and only those. I thought of the photograph with its cropped edge. Absence repeating itself, page and picture, a pattern of excision. That evening I questioned Bennett in the quad. He denied knowledge, too swiftly, and glanced toward the chapel door. His ink-stained fingers fidgeted with the strap of his satchel. I asked him what he carried in it. He said only notes, drafts, nothing of interest. His eyes told me otherwise. I let him pass, but in my mind I placed the missing page within that satchel, folded, hidden among the ordinary. Cartwright appeared not long after, her satchel lighter, her step uneven. She paused when she saw me, offered a greeting half-sung, half-spoken. I asked her whether she often worked in the library. She said yes, though not with sermons. Her voice lingered on the word as though it carried another meaning. She excused herself, hurried away, her humming, fading into the cloister. I remained, listening. The quad was still, the mist beginning to gather. The porter approached, keys clinking like distant bells. He remarked that students often tore pages, that it was nothing new. I told him this one had been cut, not torn. He said nothing, only adjusted his spectacles and turned his gaze toward the chapel roof, as though the answer might descend from the stonework itself. Back in my rooms I considered the matter. A missing page in a sermon book, why? Perhaps a quotation, a misquotation like the Milton line repeated in error. A text taken not for its theology but for its phrasing. Words have weight beyond meaning, they can be evidence, signature, accusation. The thought unsettled me more than the wine. The crossword lay open beside me. 19 across the absent fragment, 4 letters. The answer was torn, though I hesitated before filling it in. Torn suggests violence, haste, passion. What I had seen in the library was cooler, more deliberate, yet the compiler allows no subtlety. Torn was correct, if not sufficient. I wrote it in, the letters stark against the white. Later, I walked the perimeter of the college, the rain slicking the cobbles into black glass. The lamps burned dim, their light swallowed by mist. Through a window I glimpsed the historian, bent over a desk, glass in hand, papers scattered. He was copying something with a slow, deliberate hand. I watched a moment too long, until he sensed me and drew the curtain. The night carried me back to the library. The excised page, the cropped photograph, and the misquoted line were not separate. They were variations on a theme. Someone in St. Simeon's was editing reality itself, cutting and reshaping until only the desired fragments remained. What had been removed mattered less than the act of removal. Absence as authorship. When I closed the window against the rain, I thought again of the book. Sermons written to instruct and admonish. Words cut out, stolen, pressed into another context. A sermon in fragments, perhaps, but to whom was it being preached? I poured a whiskey and let the silence answer in its own way. It said nothing, and that nothing was heavier than truth. It was not the library nor the chapel that offered the next turn, but the crossword. A puzzle, after all, is not so far from a crime. Words concealed, patterns disguised, a truth waiting for the one patient enough to see it. That morning, in the quiet of my room, I unfolded the paper and stared at 21 down. Cryptic warning concealed in text, 8 letters. I tried the usual guesses. Anagram, riddle, and parables, but none would fit. My glass, untouched from the night before, still stood on the sill. The rain had eased, but left the world dim, the streets outside carrying the smell of sodden leaves. I returned to the clue, read it again, slower, concealed in text. A warning. Then it came, as such things do, suddenly, but with the inevitability of something long prepared, acrostic. A word formed from the beginnings, the margins, the overlooked. I thought back to the torn page in the sermon book, to the misquoted Milton, to the photograph with its cropped absence. Pieces of text manipulated until only fragments remained. Could it be that the missing words were not stolen for their meaning alone, but for their letters, for what they spelled when placed side by side? At St. Simeon's, I walked the cloisters with this thought gnawing at me. Students passed, their gowns damp with mist, their voices lowered. On the notice board, a new sheet had pinned a schedule for rehearsals. Cartwright's name listed among others. I traced the first letters of each line. They meant nothing. Not yet. Still, the idea refused to leave me. I found the historian in the common room, nursing a glass, though it was not yet noon. His conversation stumbled from archives to politics, yet he grew sharp when I asked about the deceased fellow. He claimed the man had been ordinary, his sermons dull, his lectures uninspired. Yet the very vehemence of his dismissal betrayed something else. I watched his fingers tighten around the stem of the glass until the wine trembled. It struck me then that he, too, was a man of letters, not merely in scholarship, but in the literal sense. Letters meant more to him than words, as clues meant more than the surface of a crossword. Cartwright approached me later by the chapel. She asked if I enjoyed puzzles, her tone light but her eyes careful. I replied that puzzles were sometimes all that held the world together. She smiled faintly, though uneasily, and said that music was a puzzle, two themes and variations, repetitions, absences. She moved away before I could ask more. The echo of her words stayed with me. Variations, absences. That evening, I returned to the sermon book in the library. Another page was missing, not torn, but carefully removed. I copied the first letters of each remaining page, line by line, as though tracing an acrostic. The letters wove no sense yet, but their rhythm carried the suggestion of intention. Someone had been building something word by word, silence by silence. Back in my room, I set the newspaper beside the copied fragments. Acrostic. The clue and the crime intertwined. I could not yet see the message, but I knew it existed, lurking behind absences, hidden in margins. The compiler of this puzzle was not the journalist of the Times, but someone within St. Simeon's, someone who believed that truth could be spelled letter by letter in a city built on stone and silence. The whiskey tasted thin that night. I sat long with the paper, listening to the rain's return upon the windows, feeling the city settle into its secrets. The crossword lay unfinished, yet more complete than most lives, and I, foolish enough to believe that patterns might reveal themselves, traced the letters again and again, waiting for the silence to speak. The trouble with Oxford is that the past never quite remains buried. It lingers in ledgers, in photographs, in the faint smell of dust upon a sermon book left too long unopened. That week, the past returned to me not with ceremony, but with a whisper of an archivist from another college, telephoning to ask whether I had heard of a certain fellow who had once lectured at St. Simeon's. His name was the same as the one now memorialized in the chapel notice. The archivist spoke of disciplinary whispers, of lectures abandoned, of debts unpaid. He ended by saying it was all forgotten now. Nothing is ever forgotten in Oxford, I told him. Only rearranged. I returned to St. Simeon's with this echo in mind. The warden received me again, his smile too practiced, his sherry too quick to be poured. He spoke of benefactors, of traditions, but when I asked whether the deceased fellow had ever caused trouble, his hand faltered upon the decanter. Only briefly, but enough. He recovered swiftly, insisting the man had been a good scholar, though eccentric. His words lacked weight. Behind them I heard the silence of omission. In the library, I found Cartwright at her usual table, pencil poised above a score. She looked up and asked if I enjoyed music. I replied that I listened poorly but remembered well. She said music was memory, after all, notes recurring, themes resurfacing, nothing ever truly lost. Her tone was casual, but the words seemed chosen. I asked her whether she had known the deceased well. She shook her head, too swiftly. Then, almost inaudibly, she added that he had once given her advice, though she would not say on what. She closed her score before I could ask further, as if drawing a curtain. Later, in the porter's lodge, I asked Grimshaw how long he had served the college. 30 years, he said, eyes fixed on the keys he polished. Long enough to remember scandals that others had forgotten. I asked whether the deceased fellow had left abruptly. Grimshaw hesitated, then said he had left quietly, but not before tempers had risen. He would not elaborate. I pressed him no further. Some men cannot be forced. They yield only by omission. That evening, back in my room, I considered the fragments. A fellow disgraced, then returned. A memorial that concealed more than it revealed. A warden uneasy with the past, a student repeating a misquotation that had travelled too far, and through it all, the pattern of absences, pages torn out, faces cropped, words distorted. The crossword that night asked for an answer I had not expected. 15 across, resurfacing memory. 7 letters. I stared at it long. At first I tried variants of echo, of relapse, of return. None would fit. Then, slowly, the letters aligned revenant. The past as a ghost, not merely recalled, but walking again among the living. I filled it in with a heaviness I could not quite explain. The rain began again, tapping against the window like a hesitant hand. I thought of the photograph, the gap where someone had been excised. I thought of the page cut neatly from the sermon book. I thought of the archivist's voice, speaking of debts and disgrace. The past had not been erased, it had only been redacted, and redaction leaves edges, clues, outlines of what was meant to vanish. The city was quiet. Somewhere a bell tolled, uneven, fractured. I poured a whiskey, smaller than usual, and let the glass rest untouched. The past had resurfaced, yes, but it had not yet declared itself. It waited in stone, on paper, in silence. Oxford does not confess it allows its ghosts to walk, hoping no one listens too closely. I listened, and the whispers grew louder. It was by the river that the first real words of admission emerged. Oxford water carries its own language, sluggish, green, whispering against the banks as though translating secrets from one century to another. I had walked there at dusk, the spires behind me dissolving into mist, when I saw Cartwright seated on a bench, her satchel at her side, staring not at the score in her lap but at the dark water. She greeted me without surprise, as though expecting my arrival. I asked what she saw in the river. She said nothing at first, then murmured that it reflected what one wished to forget. I told her forgetting was never so simple, not here. She nodded, her fingers tightening around the satchel. The water made no sound of agreement, but the silence it carried seemed to press us both. I asked her whether the deceased fellow had confided in her. She said she had only been a student, nothing more. Then, after a pause, she added that he had once entrusted her with words not music, but sentences cut from books, fragments copied, quotations bent. He had told her they formed a pattern, though she had never seen it whole. She looked down at the satchel as she spoke, as if it contained the missing pieces. The current lapped faintly at the stones. I remembered the photograph, the cropped absence. The page was excerpted from the sermon book, the misquoted Milton, each an attempt to rearrange the truth. I asked her who had encouraged her to keep those fragments. She whispered a name, though I will not set it down here. Oxford teaches restraint, and confession spoken by water should remain with the water. Still, I noticed something in her hesitation. Her voice caught not on the name itself, but on the syllable before it, as though she had rehearsed another name, almost spoken it, then replaced it. The truest confessions are often half erased. She rose then, said she must return before Hall. I asked whether she believed the fellow's death had been natural. She looked at me, eyes dark in the gathering mist, and replied only that nothing in St. Simeon's ever was. She left, her steps fading across the damp grass, the satchel pressed tight against her side. I remained by the river. The water seemed to breathe with me, slow, unhurried, indifferent. In its shifting, I thought of another clue, from that morning's crossword, 20 down admission as a flowing element, 10 letters. I had puzzled over it for hours. By the water it came with a cruel clarity of confession, both word and answer, written not in ink, but in the hesitation of a girl's voice, in the fragments she carried like contraband in a satchel. The mist thickened, and with it my unease. A confession, yes, but not yet the truth. There are confessions that reveal and confessions that distract. Water reflects, but it also distorts. What Cartwright had spoken might have been her burden, or one she had been persuaded to carry for another. The river gave no verdict. As I walked back through the streets, the lamps flickered in pools upon the cobbles. Each reflection trembled with the weight of rain. I thought again of the word revenant, the resurfacing of what was meant to vanish. The past had returned not as fact, but as fragments, quotations, letters, absences. And now, by water, a confession, though whether it was her own or another's, I could not yet tell. Back in my room I left the whiskey untouched. The paper still lay upon the desk, the crossword half completed, the ink faint where my hand had faltered. Confession, I wrote in block letters. The word stared back, unyielding, a puzzle solved yet unresolved. Outside, the rain fell into the city's veins, each drop carrying its own small silence. Oxford, as always, spoke most clearly when it said nothing at all. The case, if it may be called that, ended not with revelation, but with water. Oxford has always allowed its mysteries to dissolve into Isis, to flow away as if the city itself could not bear their weight. I remember standing on Folly Bridge one late evening, the lamps bending their light into the current, and thinking how the river absorbed all stories, all sins, without judgment. By then, I had collected enough fragments to make something resembling an answer. A misquotation passed from mouth to mouth, a photograph with a cropped absence, a sermon with its page excised, and finally, a confession whispered by water. Each piece was incomplete, yet together they formed the shape of something larger, though whether it was truth or only the outline of truth, I cannot say. In Oxford, outlines are often all one is permitted. Cartwright had vanished from my view after that dusk by the river, her satchel clasped close, her words left hanging like the mist. Bennett kept to the library, staining his fingers with ink, avoiding me with the skill of a practiced scholar. The historian laughed too loudly at dinner, his cuff once again marked with wine, and the warden continued to pour sherry with a hand just steady enough to suggest that what trembled was not the glass, but the man himself. Each of them guilty, each innocent, depending upon where one chose to place the missing page. The porter, Grimshaw, remained the same, his keys jangling faintly, his spectacles smudged, his voice deferential. He knew more than he said, but he would carry his silence to retirement and beyond. Silence was the currency of his years of service. One night I returned to the library. The air was still, the lamps dimmed, the books breathing their dust. On the desk where the sermon volume had once lain, I found another, similar but whole. No page torn, no absence. Yet I could not shake the sense that something had been removed from me instead, as if the college itself had excised my presence, leaving only the faint impression of a visitor's name in the lodge book. The crossword that day had offered its final cruelty. 24 cross. Flowing on without end, 5 letters. The answer was the river. Simple, inevitable, mocking in its clarity. I wrote it in, though my hand wavered. The river flows, indifferent to the bodies, the confessions, the silences it carries. One cannot hold it still long enough to demand an answer, and so I let the matter rest, not resolved, not concluded, only released into the current. Perhaps Cartwright's confession was her own, or perhaps it had been placed upon her by another hand. Perhaps the missing page spelled out an accusation, or perhaps it was only the vanity of a scholar playing games with letters. Perhaps the cropped photograph concealed a face too dangerous, or only a smile too careless. Each, perhaps, drifted away, like leaves upon the water, circling once before disappearing into darkness. I often walked by the river in those days, listening to its endless patience. It moved with neither haste nor hesitation, carrying its burden without protest. I thought of the deceased fellow, his name now engraved in the chapel memorial. His life, too, had been reduced to a fragment, a line cut neatly into stone, its context forever missing. Perhaps that was the truest fate of all of us in Oxford, to be remembered not as whole, but as partial, as absence as much as presence. When the bell of St. Simeon's tolled across the evening, uneven as always, I felt the case slip from my grasp. The city had decided, as it always does, to keep its secrets. I had been permitted to hear whispers, no more. And so I left the river to move on, carrying what I could not carry, answering what I could not answer. Back in my room I closed the paper, the crossword complete but unsatisfying. I poured the last measure of whiskey, raised it briefly toward the darkening window, and drank in silence. Outside, the river continued its journey, indifferent to words, to absences, to men who sought meaning where perhaps none was meant to be found.